Hey everybody, welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and today's episode is something a little bit different. We're doing something called the No Stupid Questions Q&A episode. So, earlier this week, if you have not caught wind of this on my Twitter, the Discord, or the stream, I put up a website where I got people to ask whatever question they would like, anonymously, which is important. The impetus from this came from the fact that I noticed in my stream and also the Discord, and people were like private messaging me and asking coaching sessions, prefacing a lot of their questions with, I know this is a very stupid question, but, or I can't believe I'm actually asking this, but there seems to be a lot of questions that people are afraid to ask because they feel like they should know the answer to already. Or it's like, you know, when you forget somebody's name or you don't know somebody's name and you've met them for 3 times in a row and you're like, man, it's just too late to ask at this point. Kind of those kind of questions. There's been a lot of those and we received a lot that we're going to talk about today. So it's cool both in the sense that kind of an outlet for people to honestly ask those questions if they don't want to, stick their head out there. But also I think it's cool because even people that do know the answer to some of these questions, I want to get to some fundamentals, just kind of retrace some fundamentals to kind of break down why, why we play 17 lands, what makes for a good splash, that kind of stuff. So without further ado, let's get into the Patreon. The Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That is the number one place that you can go if you want to support the show. If you like what we're doing here, if you feel like you've gotten some value in some way, if you feel like maybe you want a few more drafts, maybe you've learned something, best place you can go to support the show. And of course, we want to give back to you. There's a bunch of reward tiers over there at the Patreon. Even if you're not sure if you want to support the Patreon, I consider just go take a look, right? It's there's a lot of things over there that I'm giving back to you in the form of coaching, in the form of help on Discord. There's deck techs, there's draft video reviews that I offer, a bunch of good stuff, access to the weekly or bi-weekly quarter classes. So yeah, I encourage you to check it out. And thank you so much, of course, to everybody who supports each week. Really, really do appreciate it. It really helps the show keep on going and helps me do what I love to do. Without further ado, let's get into the questions. So I think I received about 50 questions overall, and I've grouped a lot of them together. So if you answered a question, if you asked a question and you didn't hear yours exactly read, it might have been grouped in with one that was similar. I felt like, I didn't want to retrace a bunch of steps. There was also a lot of really funny questions, and I was trying to decide if I wanted to include those, like, how do you silence Dokuchi? Stuff like that. I figured maybe that was best left for another day. Maybe April Fool's podcast. So I just kept the more serious questions, the ones on the more educational side of things. So let's get into question 1 here. And question 1 here is land counts. The question is, how do you figure out how many lands your deck wants? 17 seems to have been the norm for so long, but now I feel like I see streamers playing a relatively wide range of land counts. Why was 17 the number for so long, and what factors influence your land counts? This was a huge one. This was one that I got, I think 10 people probably asked some variant of this. So I think it's good to start here. So number 1, why do we play 17 lands? 2 main reasons. The 2 main reasons we play 17 lands in our limited decks are, 1, so we can reach our minimum mana sources of 8 and 8 of our main colors. And that's a big one. Because if you play 15 lands, let's say, that gets you to, if you're an even split, that's 8 and 7 of your main colors. And why that's important to get to 8 and 8 is because that gives you a good chance of casting a 2-drop of whatever color it is on turn 2. So if you only have 5 sources in your deck, a red 2-drop is very unlikely to be cast on turn 2. The same goes for your secondary color. So often if you have an even split of colors, you want to have that even split of mana, get to that 8 sources, right? So can't go below that. The second thing is we play 17 lands to hit 4 lands on turn 4. In most limited decks, I would say this is something you would like to do, right? Some decks want to hit turn 6, land 6 on turn 6. Some decks don't really care that much. They want to hit, turn 3 or land 3 on turn 3, and then it's like, okay, past that, it's not a huge deal. I would say in the majority of decks are kind of in that mid-rangey space. 4 lands on turn 4 is something that you would like, and if there's a little bit of variation on each side, that's okay. That's, there's going to be some variation in the lands you drop. So that's the main reason we play 17 lands. I believe as decks have become more polarized in recent years. There's been really, really aggressive decks, really, really controlling decks in some formats. This is going to change a little bit, or you'll see more variation in land counts, right? You're going to go 216, 215 more often. In Kamigawa, I've been playing 15 land decks, sometimes because, my curve just really demands that, or there's other reasons, and we'll get into those. And sometimes you're going to be like, I really want to cast my Imperial Oath on turn 6, right? That matters a lot. I really want to not have my multiple Imperial Oaths stuck in my hand. So you really want to make sure you have 18 mana sources, 19 mana sources like that. Tied into this, I want to touch on some factors that influence your land count. So, number one, curve. That's, I think, the biggest one. The lower your curve, the fewer lands you need. I think it's very easy, just considering how lands get talked about in Limited, that 17 is just the number that you play. That's what we do. That's what we do almost always, right? But I do think for every single deck, you should consider, hey, does this deck really want more on the side of 16? More on the side of 18? I think while 17 lands is the gold standard, I don't think it's at all a given. So your curve, one of the biggest things, right? So if you've got a lot of ones, a lot of twos, I'm talking 5, 6, 7 ones, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 twos, you want to lean towards 16, sometimes 15, right? And of course, the opposite is true if you have more expensive stuff. That's your main thing. I would say, unless you can look at your deck and go, wow, this is an anomaly, in the sense that, like, I've got a lot of ones and a lot of twos, or on the other side of the spectrum, man, I've got a lot of 5s and a lot of 6s, probably just want to stick to 17 and then diverge from there, right? Chat's asking about the best of one hand smoother. That's a good question. So, I will not be going in depth 100% on the hand smoother. I want to touch on it, but I don't want to, I think Sirkovitz has put out like an hour-long conversation about this, or on his podcast, on his weekly Twitch stream he does. So I'll defer to Sirkovitz, but I know that if you want to play 17 lands, and like let's say you're between 17 and 16 lands, and you're like, I'm not sure which one I should be playing, you could be playing 16 lands, and the hand smoother will give you enough lands that you'll be like at 16 and a half, kind of, right? So you'll have your opening hand will be 3 lands a lot of the time, or 4 lands a lot of the time, so you'll be able to get there. But here is the trick. Here's what I always say about that when people bring this up, right? Often people go, oh, my deck wants 17 lands, but Best of One says I'll have, if I play 16, I'll still have that opening hand of 3 lands, 4 lands. This is true. But you have to ask yourself, does your 17 land deck really fall on the side of, hey, I would like to draw 3 lands more often than not, or do I want to draw 5 lands more often than not? If you want to draw 5 lands more often than not, I would still play 17 lands, because the Best of One hand smoother only affects your opening hand, right? It doesn't affect the cards you draw after that. So sure, you've got, land 3, land 4, and you'll draw land 5 eventually. But if you really want to hit land 5 on turn 5, so you have some really good 5 drops you really want to cast, or you want to double spell, you've got a lot of 3s and 4s potentially, I would still defer to 17 lands. The second thing that influences your land counts is the need for color sources. Like I was saying, 8 and 8 is your minimum that you need to reach for each of your colored sources. This is going to change if your deck is heavily slanted towards one color. Obviously, your mana base is going to be affected by that. The fewer colored sources you need, say you're closer to monocolored, you can cut on lands. A lot of my mono-red decks in this format, in Kamigawa, go to 15, sometimes in extreme cases, 14 lands, because I don't need to, get both of my colored sources on turn 2. I just need to get red. The inverse is true as well. If your deck has a lot of colored sources, it's playing 3, 4, 5 colors, you often want to push towards more colored sources because you just can't fit in enough colored sources with 17 lands. So what this often manifests as is you'll be playing your base 2 colors, where you need 8 and 8 of your main sources, right? And you need to have, maybe you're double splashing. You're splashing a blue card and a red card. Well, you can't just put mountains and islands in your mana base. That just doesn't work. So sometimes, you've got a dual land in there. Maybe you've got a network terminal. You count those for sources. But then you also put in 2 other basic lands, an island and a mountain, and then you go up to like 19 or 18 lands. That's something you could do as well. So the more colored sources you have, the more lands you want to have. And as long as you're, here's the key thing. If you can retain the integrity of that 8 and 8 of your main sources, right, your main 2 colors, then you can add or subtract appropriately. That's the most important thing to maintain, though. Another thing that influences the number of lands is cheap versus expensive card draw. So often there's the question of, does card draw influence my mana base in the sense that I want more lands or fewer lands? Because there's the idea, if you draw more cards, well, you're going to see more lands, you can cast more, play more spells, right? Or play more lands. But there's also the idea where it's like, well, if you've got a lot of card draw in your deck, you want more lands because you want to be able to deploy all the cards that you cast, right? You want to be able to go like, all right, I've drawn a bunch of cards. I don't want to be stuck with them all in my hand. I want to be hitting land drops every turn. It's kind of both. What matters here is what the card draw looks like. The cheaper the card draw, the fewer lands I want to play. The more expensive the card draw is, the more lands I want to play. So the way that this plays out sometimes is cards with cycling, right? 1 mana cycling. We saw this in Ikoria as the extreme example, where it's like you had a bunch of 1 mana cyclers in your deck, and if you needed to hit a land drop, you could. So you could go to a lower land count. Another place where this pops up is if you have a bunch of 2-drop creatures that draw you a card, or 2-drop things that draw you a card. For example, Spirited Companion in this format. If you've got, 4 of those, let's say, you could probably skimp on a land, right? That probably pushes me to being like, okay, these Spirited Companions will all draw me into a percentage of a land, so that kind of counts. The opposite of true is true, of course, if you've got expensive card draw, because if you're putting the card draw in your deck to hit more mana sources, well, you need to get to that threshold of 4 or 5 or 3 mana before you actually cast it. So, you don't want to be skimping there. And the other thing, of course, is often when you are casting an expensive card draw spell, that's often in a controlling deck where that's like your finisher or your way to gas up. And you don't necessarily want to, or sometimes just can't cast it early. That's going to be something once you hit your land drops a little bit later in the game. Cantrips also play into this too. That counts as cheap card draw, something like an Opt, something like a Preordained, if you think of Constructed. That pushes me a little bit towards playing fewer lands. But these are all kind of gray areas too, right? It's never like a hard, this is this number of cantrips, this number of cheap plays that draw me a card, I can cut this number of lands. It's all kind of feeling it out. And I'm just kind of, the things I'm saying here today are just mostly talking about or giving you some idea of the things that would push you away or towards more or fewer lands. Another thing that influences your land count, number of mana sources. So if you've got a bunch of 2 mana mana dorks or 3 mana mana dorks or mana producers, network terminals, or grafted growth, pushes you towards a few fewer lands, right? You have to be careful though, because once you get past 1 and 2 mana for your mana dork, you can't really be skimping on lands. Because, if you draw a Llanowar Elves, right, or 1 mana dork in your opening hand, that essentially counts as a land. That's for all intents and purposes a land as long as you have another forest. But if you draw 2 lands and a network terminal, and you're counting that network terminal as a land, well, that gets a little bit sketchy. You probably can't do that. And most of the times when you're playing network terminal or a grafted growth, your deck probably wants like 18, 19 mana sources anyway, so you should just play 17 lands there most of the time. The final thing, of course, that influences your land count is, do you have places to put the mana? So even in your red decks, your aggressive red decks in this format, I sometimes play 17 lands or 16 lands, maybe not 18, that's a little bit aggressive, right? But if I've got a lot of experimental synthesizers, if I've got a lot of monkeys, the equipping monkeys, simian slings, or rabbit batteries, if I know I'm going to be using my mana not just for casting spells, that pushes me a little bit further towards, more lands rather than fewer lands. Even in your controlling decks, the same thing applies. If you don't have a lot of places to put your mana, maybe you've just got, a card draw spell, 1 mana sink, you can probably survive on 17 and sometimes even go to 16 in rare cases in those controlling decks. All that kind of pushes you towards saying, in aggressive decks, you want to play fewer lands, right? You need fewer mana sources, you're not going to have as much late game, you're not going to have as many places to put your lands, and in controlling decks, inverse is true. There are some exceptions though. In controlling decks that don't have card draw and have a lot of cheap interaction instead, I'm often pushed towards fewer lands. So a good example of this is like a black-white control deck. I think Theros Beyond Death had a pretty good black-white control deck where you had a bunch of 2 and 3 mana removal spells. It's like 2 mana, -3, 3 mana passivism effects, where I know the game is going to go long, so I don't actually want to play 17 or 18 lands, because I don't have ways to capitalize on or use all that mana over the course of the game, and the game's going to go on, and I'm going to accrue a bunch of lands, and I have nothing to do with those lands. Because you're very good at surviving early, because you have all those cheap interaction spells, I would often play 16 lands in those decks because I would just be like, okay, I'm not going to die early. I'm going to have time to draw my, hit my land drops. And then after the game goes on for a few more turns, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 turns, I don't want to be drawing my land 7, 8, 9 because I had nothing to do with them. That's a rare case, but it does come up. And you'll see that in decks that have a lot of removal spells, but not a lot of card advantage. In aggro decks, sometimes you want a lot of lands if you are reliant on curving out. And a lot of decks are reliant on curving out, a lot of aggro decks. This mostly means if you don't have a lot of reach, or if your threats don't scale. So think of a green-red aggro deck, where it wants to play like a chonky 2-drop, a chonky 3-drop, 4-drop, a 4-mana 4/4. Specifically, if your card has landfall, that's a very obvious example, but Brushfire Elemental from Zendikar Rising is the 2-mana 1/1 with haste, and then landfall gets +2/+2. You ought to be hitting your land drops. That is a good reason to play more lands, play 17, 18 lands, because often those decks that are hoping to kill your opponent just by curving out and having bigger things along the curve, they can't afford to miss some land drops, because if they miss some land drops and then their key thing for pushing damage is a 4-mana 4/4, and that 4-mana 4/4 doesn't get cast until turn 7 or something, that's just a disaster. If your deck instead operates by evasion, right, or it has a lot of reach, a lot of burn spells, or if your threats scale, something like Flourishing Fox from Ikoria, where it's just like, okay, I don't mind if I play this on 1, I don't mind if I play this on 5, it's going to get big eventually. That means you can push towards, that 16, 15 land count instead. That's okay. Pegasus Courser is another good one. This is a card that actually hasn't been printed in a while. They used to print this quite a bit, but this is a 3-mana 1/3 flyer. Whenever this attacks, something else gets flying, right? What this comes down to is if you have good ways to push damage, even when you don't perfectly curve out, you can push towards fewer lands. But if you're reliant on that curve out, push towards 17, sometimes even 18 lands if you got good 4s and 5s in your aggro decks. All right, that's question 1. I promise you they won't all be this long. Question 2, what does the deck need? So the next question is, what are the top 3 things you need to draft in an aggro deck? And what about a control deck? So this is just archetype needs, necessities, things that you need for these archetypes to function, these broad, limited archetypes. So I'm just going to do quickly aggro, and then we'll get into control. Aggro, my top 3 things. Number 1 is redundancy of cheap plays. If your aggro deck does not have a lot of 1s, it doesn't have a lot of 2s, it's not an aggro deck. Because if you're not playing a 2-drop, 80% of the time, a 1-drop 80% of the time, then you're not going to be able to pressure very well. And you're just going to be a mid-rangey pile with some aggressive cards. That's not going to work. You need to have 8, 9, 10 2-drops or 1-drops, right? I guess maybe a blanket way to put this is you want to have 10 plays before turn 3. If you don't have that, you're going to have a lot of trouble actually taking that aggressive role. Number 2, you need interactions / ways to push damage, ways to make blocks difficult. This could be removal spells, Kami Flares. It could be, any cheap interaction spell that'll get a 2-drop out of the way, a 3-drop out of the way. Or it could also be something like Ironhoof Boar, right? Just or Run Amok, a trample trick, something that goes, you block, doesn't matter, I use this trick, I'm pushing damage. Tapper, something to tap down a blocker. Anything that makes it hard for your opponent to attack. That's like your mid game, right? The 1-drops are your early game. The 1-drops 2, that's what you play early. The turn 3, turn 4, you're curving out. Maybe you're casting a removal spell or casting a way to push damage so that your opponent's early blockers don't do anything. That's the mid game. And then the late game for your aggro decks is the reach. Ways to close out the game. Ideally, you've got burn spells, right? Cards that kill your opponent's creatures early, go to the face late. That's ideal for your burn decks. But sometimes you don't have that luxury, right? Some formats just don't have burn spells that go to the face. Sometimes you don't pick them up in the draft. So you can kind of default to something like the Shattered States era. And the Shattered States era, the 5-mana red saga at common, is actually a card I've been playing quite a lot in my close to mono red decks in the format. It's just a card that I've consistently been impressed with, just stealing their 5-drop, steal their 6-drop, attack them with it, and the 2 other modes push more damage. You can obviously have better cards at the top end too. If you have a big dragon, or if you have something like a Thundering Raiju, that's great too. It could also be something in the form of these, X creatures can't block this turn, or your opponent's creatures without flying, they can't block this turn. You need something to push that damage in the late game, because not every single game is going to be perfect where you go, I've curved out perfectly, I've killed the blockers, and now I just win. I'd say, 40% of games, 30% of games do come down to, hey, the game's stalled out a little bit. My opponent has stabilized pretty well. I need to draw into these late game cards. There is some amount of opportunity cost with having these late game cards in your deck. You don't want to have too many of them because if you do, you draw them too early in your opening hand and you don't want to 5-drop in your opening hand. If I have like 2 or 3 of these kind of cards, I'm pretty happy, especially if they maybe play double duty, right? Sometimes the X creatures can't block or creatures without flying can't block comes with an additional mode. It'll say like, destroy target artifact or something like that. If your finisher card has some modality, that's the sign of a good finisher card. Again, pointing to something like a lightning bolt, right? A 1-mana deal 3 to a creature or a player. That's ideal. That has modality, kills a creature or kills a player when they're at 3. It's very good to draft your aggro decks optimistically and saying, I'm going to curve out perfectly. I think that's great. But you also need to account for the fail case. At least make some concessions to it. So just to recap, number 1, aggro decks need redundancy of cheap plays, needs interaction or ways to push damage in the mid game. Number 3, reach, ways to close at the game. And then control deck. So 3 things. Number 1 it needs is plays on turn 2. This could be interaction spells, or it could be a 2-drop, right? It could be a lethal exploit. It could be a Bamboo Grove Archer, a good blocker. The important thing here, though, is that you need to do something on turn 2 almost always, because if you don't, that's when you start to fall behind. That's when you start to go, okay, maybe I missed my 2-drop. My opponent played a 2-drop. They attacked me for 2, but I have a 3-drop, and it's pretty good. I'm fine playing that. Then they kill the 3-drop, and then they also play, a 1-drop as well. And you go, okay, now I'm in. I'm in for some trouble here. If you can match them, play that defensive speed, match them play for play in the early game, that's where the aggressive deck has some troubles. But if you miss that turn 2 play, or turn 1, like could be a good defensive turn 1 play too, that's where you really start to fall behind. So kind of paradoxically, you would think your aggressive decks want more cheap plays than your controlling decks, which, is true. But your controlling decks also want a good number of cheap plays as well. They want to have, I'd say 6 things to do, 7 things to do before turn 3. Second thing, removal. In a long game, which is what you're expecting to play in a control deck, you need removal spells. I am somebody who generally deprioritizes removal spells, but I will admit if you are planning to get to turn 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, removal is just a necessity. There's going to be cards you have to deal with. You can't just deal with all of your opponent's cards by blocking. There's going to be flyers, there's going to be bombs, there's going to be cards with activated abilities. You need some amount of interaction spells. I'm probably aiming for somewhere in the neighborhood of like 5 to 6 if I can get that. And then the last part of the puzzle here for the control decks, card advantage or higher rarity cards, right? You need some way to, after you have controlled the game, you have, interacted with your opponent's things, you take over the game from there. Either that's something like Behold the Unspeakable, to draw a bunch of cards and make a threat. The Kami War is obviously one of the better ones, just like an insane finisher. Boseiju Reaches Skyward is a pretty good example of that. Often, this will be something that is a higher rarity card, an uncommon or a rare. You don't often find yourself in control decks based on your commons, right? Often you get in because you open a cool rare and you want to get to the late game. It's kind of funny, in this format, in Kamigawa, there's actually an exception to that, where Imperial Oath is a really good common finisher. Most formats don't have good common finishers. You usually need to open some giant dragon or some, inevitability engine. Oh, that's actually an interesting point, too. You really want your finisher to be an inevitability engine, not just like Big Dumb Dragon, right? Because Big Dumb Dragon often just gets killed. It needs to be something that, when it comes down, you are an overwhelming favorite to win the game, because especially if you're not presenting threats early, which you're not in your control deck very often, your opponent's going to have accrued a bunch of removal spells in their hand that they can't use very much. So when you play your finisher, if it's not something that generates value on entry or is hard to deal with, they're just going to go, all right, kill it, because I've had this removal spell sitting in my hand a lot of the time, right? Just it's been rotting away in my hand. Finally, you play your finisher, I can kill that, right? So word of caution in most formats, don't go into control decks unless you have a really good reason to. They just don't really work that well at common very often. And the other thing I want to touch on is the card advantage front. You really do need some card advantage to push through the mid game or the late game. Otherwise, you're kind of just like 1-for-1ing forever. You're killing your opponents 1 and 2 and 3, and then you're kind of sitting there, and then they draw a 5-drop, and you're like, welp, I guess I hope I draw my good cards. You need somewhere to turn through your deck. You need somewhere to convert you killing your opponent's creatures into an actual win. Question 3. Why do you sort that way, Alex? What's the best way to sort your deck when drafting on MTGO or MTGA? And why are you not doing that on stream? So for those who don't watch my stream, I commonly get called out for sorting my cards kind of in a weird way. I don't sort by CMC very often. I kind of have them in piles, and people are like, I don't understand at all how you're sorting here. What's going on here? Why don't you just sort by CMC? So I do have a good reason. I do have a real reason. I do want to actually discuss it, and I think it's actually helpful. This isn't just me trying to defend myself. I think this way of sorting is actually beneficial and actually helps you draft. So the way I sort early on in the draft is by color or by synergy pairs. So what I mean is often you'll see me have a column of black cards I've picked up early, and a column of white cards I've picked up early, and a column of red cards I've picked up early. Or I'll have a column of cards that all play well together, all the enchantments, right? The reason I'm doing this is because I'm still trying to feel out the draft, and by putting the cards in this column, or in these columns, I can more easily see how heavily the cards I've already picked up weights towards me getting deeper into that archetype or that, that color. So often I think what happens is people first pick a bomb, or first pick a rare, first pick a removal spell, whatever it is, and they go, okay, I slot that in the 4 CMC slot. And then they take a 2-drop and they go, that's my 2 CMC slot. And then they keep doing that, almost like you would build a constructed deck, right? Where it's like, I'm plotting things out, I'm plotting them in the different mana cost slots. I don't think that's actually the best way to do it early. Because if you do that early, you kind of get locked into like, this is my deck, and I'm kind of just painting by numbers here, filling in those holes, putting things in the right curve in the right place. When you do that, you kind of assume that your starting deck, where you started out, is going to end up similar to where you actually end up in the end, right? And that's not always true. You're going to be bobbing and weaving, you're going to be pivoting. I think what's more helpful is instead do what I do. Again, this isn't going to be for everybody, but I think this does have some merit. And organized by the colors you have stake in, and the synergy packages or pockets you have stake in. This way you can weigh when, in pick 4, pick 5, pick 6, pick 7 comes along, you go, there's a really good red card and a really good black card. I don't know which one to take. Which one am I supposed to take here? You go, well, my black's a lot stronger than my red. Even though I have some red in the pile, I'm going to take the black card. This is also a good way to naturally anchor into a color, which is something I talked about a lot, right? Anchoring into a color so you can pivot later, or easier later. If you don't anchor into a color and you go black card, red card, black card, red card, black card, red card, you open up a blue bomb impact 2 and you go, I can't take that, right? Anchor in just black, it's easy to just take that blue bomb impact 2. Hopefully that explains that a little bit. I will admit, sometimes even when I do this method, I do have random cards scattered in there. I have a blue card in the black pile, I have a red card in the white pile. But try this out, and hopefully if you watch me on stream and you're perplexed, this gives you a little bit of an answer. All right, question 4, the dreaded 9-8 mana base. I hear a lot of content creators saying that 9-8 or 8-7 mana bases are bad. Could you elaborate on this? It's something I've defaulted to, especially when it feels like my colors are roughly balanced. Yeah, for sure. So the idea here is that limited mana bases mathematically are just poor. They lead you to not casting your spells in a timely fashion. A lot of the time, I'm sure you've experienced where it's like, well, I just need that red source, and you don't get it until turn 8. That doesn't happen in Constructed as often because you've got a bunch of dual lands. You often have your colors. There's still the situation in Constructed where you don't draw enough lands, you draw too few lands, you draw way more lands than you wanted to. But color screw happens a lot less often in Constructed because dual lands exist. In Limited, though, the 9-8 mana base is not good. It's just what we have to deal with. It's just the necessary evil because we don't often get access to dual lands, right? This is why a lot of people will consider picking up dual lands, or they'll recommend picking up dual lands when you can, even when you're not splashing, because it makes the 9-8 mana base a lot more tenable. You're no longer 9-8, you're like 10-9, or pick up 2, you're like 11-10 or something like that, right? So it's not that you shouldn't play 9-8 if you don't have dual lands. That's what you kind of have to do a lot of the time. It's that you have to. Now, there is something to be said for if you can weight your mana base towards one color, right? You have, let's say, 18 red spells and the rest are black spells. That actually makes your mana base a lot better because then you can throw in, 10, 11 red sources and then the rest black sources. And most of the time you'll be able to cast your red spells, and most of the time you'll be able to cast your black because you're not going to draw that many black spells because you don't have that many in your deck. All you really need is like one swamp maybe to cast those black spells, and you're good. The 2 things you can do to fix this dreaded 8-9 mana base: 1, pick up dual lands. 2, if you can, weight your deck towards one color. Often, there's kind of this idea, I think often people, when they're first taught drafting, the person tells them, you pick your 2 colors, you're going to be half and half those colors, right? But that's not ideal, right? There is some merit to, if you can weight towards one color, you should do that, because that used to improve your consistency, and improving consistency is something you would love to do in all of your limited decks, or just all of your Magic decks in general. Question 5, are slower decks better for better players? So, does it make sense to bias towards slower decks when playing weaker players to maximize your agency through the game? So, this comes from an idea of, if you're playing a long game, you're likely to have more decision points in the game than in a short game, and over the span of making multiple decisions over multiple decision points, the better player will make the better decisions and lead to a better outcome in their game. So the thought often is, better players like to play slower decks or controlling decks because they have more options. They have more time to, have the game play out. They're not going to get run over by an aggro deck and kind of get, quote unquote cheesed out of the game, which I think is actually a little bit unfair to aggro decks. I think there's something to be said for the skill it takes to play an aggro deck, because I do think it's actually deceptively hard to play an aggro deck well. I think there is merit to this idea. So the question is, does it make sense to bias towards slower decks when playing weaker players? No, I don't think so. I think you should just play, against weaker players, I think you just are going to win most of the time anyway, so I wouldn't make too many concessions. Should you play slower decks if you think you're a better player than the rest of the player base? Maybe. That's something you could do, but at the same time, I think people generally overrate their skill sets when playing against similarly experienced players. So if you're a drafter who's drafting on the ladder on MTGA, you're going to be drafting against people that are pretty similar to you in skill, and maybe you're advantaged. Maybe that's true in a long game. Maybe you think you have better decision-making skills than your opponent, but maybe you don't. Maybe you're overestimating that. I think there is something I like to call kind of the allure of agency, right? As Magic players, I think if once you start playing a long time, you kind of get stuck in a rut of being like, man, this game's full of so much variance, and I really just want to I want to have more control over what I'm doing. And that's certainly reasonable. That is a noble goal to achieve, I will say. At the same time, though, there is something to be said for playing a deck that's just good and just does its own thing. Like, the example I would give is if there's a deck that's a really, really powerful aggro deck, right? You don't have that many decisions in the game, right? There's maybe, over the course of 5 turns, you have 10 real decisions, as opposed to, in a longer game, you'd have 20 or 25, something like that. I think that a lot of experienced players kind of go, well, in that longer game, I'll have more decisions and I can leverage my skill. That kind of discounts the raw power of what that deck is just doing, right? And sometimes, even though you have fewer decisions that you can make and express your skill within, that good aggro deck is just gonna get you a lot of EV, get you a lot of wins, because it's just going to run over the opponents who stumble. It's just going to, have awesome curve outs a lot of the time. There's this allure that says, ooh, agency, I really like that. But a lot of times, just if you're just playing the best cards, even if they're aggressive cards, they're going to be pretty good, right? And I think that's the trap people fall into a lot of times, and they go, I don't really like aggro decks that much. And not to say that this, the concept of, longer games benefit the stronger players doesn't apply. I think that is true. I guess this is more turning into me advocating for aggro decks than anything else, and also saying, to the original question, if you're playing weaker players, you're probably just going to win anyway, so I wouldn't make many concessions to it. Chat brings up something. Septimin brings up a point with this allure of agency thought. Does this also apply to mulligans? Yes, I think it does. I think often, so I'm a player that, if you've heard any of my content, watched any of my content, you'll know that I mulligan very infrequently. I think it is it's a huge cost to go down a card in limited, and people mulligan too often. People are afraid of fail cases of, ooh, what if this hand doesn't get there? When a lot of the time, having 7 cards is just good enough. And I think having the decision or having the ability to mulligan is a little bit, there's that allure of agency where you go, well, I'm a responsible player. I can mulligan this hand and come up with a better hand because I'm making the correct decision. But the opposite of that, kind of the, just let the cards do their thing approach, is just keep 7 cards. And that's going to be good enough a lot of the time. Your hand doesn't have to be perfect, right? I think that's something I stress all the time. Your hand does not have to be perfect to keep it. It just needs to be somewhat functional. Or somewhat functional if you consider the top end cards of your library. You're assuming you're going to draw a land in the next few turns, right? And there's this thought where it's like, well, I'm very responsible. I'm going to mulligan. I'm making a decision that will influence the outcome of my game. But sometimes you're making a decision that actually influences it negatively, right? So again, I don't want to get into the mulligan topic just yet, but yes, that's a very good point. That a lot of times I think people think of taking a mulligan as, oh, look, I'm increasing my win rate by mulliganing, when really keeping 7 cards is just going to get you a lot of the way there. All right, question 6, narrow cards. How do you evaluate a narrow card? Something like Light the Way or Tamiyo Safekeeping in your deck. When should you choose to include them? When do you put them in your deck? Do you put them in your deck when you might just need to get a little bit lucky, and you may want to put a card in that kind of like spikes a win, right? So often when I'm choosing to play a narrow card, it means that I am low on playables, right? I'm kind of choosing the worst or the best of the bad cards to play my 22nd, 23rd card. And often when I'm in that spot, I ask myself, which one of these narrow cards is most often going to be relevant? Narrow cards are, by definition, narrow. They don't have a lot of applications or a few applications in a game where they're good. That doesn't always mean that they are weak cards. They're kind of different axes, right? You can have a strong card, but it's narrow. And you can also have a not so strong card, but it's widely applicable, right? So something like Dark Ritual, for those who know older cards, one black mana, instant speed, put 3 black mana into your mana pool. It's a very narrow card, and you don't see it. You wouldn't play that card in Limited very often because it is only good in a subset of Magic games where tempo is, the tempo axis of the game is extremely pushed, and you just want to power out a powerful combo or a large creature quickly. In Limited, decks are much more about card quantity, where you can't just give up a card. But it's a very powerful card in the abstract because you're really granted a big mana boost, and that is giant in some formats, right? Being able to play your Necropotence or whatever on turn 1 is amazing, or your Hypnotic Spectre if you're a player from the 90s. But at the same time, that's not a card you're going to want to put in your deck a lot of the time. I see that as a similar or an analog to narrow cards in Limited. So a good example is Light the Way. Light the Way is a single white mana. For a instant, it says put a counter on a creature or vehicle, untap it, or return a permanent you control to your owner's hand. If you're going to play a narrow card, you want that narrow card to be relevant in a lot of situations. So if I'm going to play this Light the Way, I want it to be in a deck where I'm, 1, going to be getting into combat often, where that +1/+1 counter is going to matter, and 2, I have good things to pick up. Maybe I have sagas, maybe I have ETB creatures, stuff like that, right? So often when I'm deciding to play these narrow cards, it is in the situation where it's not actually going to be narrow in my deck. So ask yourself, hey, is this Light the Way going to be dead a lot of the time? Am I going to be waiting around for my opponent to cast a removal spell on my creature and I have to wait to pick it up? Or am I going to get into combat often? Am I going to have things that I proactively want to pick up my cards with, right? Stuff like that. That's often the thought process when playing narrow cards. Question 7, transferring skills. How much of the information learned/gathered should we be carrying over from one format to another? So this is a good question. I think often it's a tricky one because, we spend 3 months playing a format and we learn heuristics about the format, what kind of cards are good, what kind of cards are bad, and then 3 months later, a new format comes along and you go, hey, all the things you knew about this type of card, removal spells, or 2-drops, is no longer true, right? Just scrub that from your memory. Now 2-drops are bad, now removal's good, where it wasn't the case last time, right? And that can kind of be a little frustrating, I think. So the way I like to think about this is every format teaches you something to put in your repertoire of tools and the greater scheme of Magic, right? Now, not all of those tools will be applicable in every format, but the more tools you have, the easier you will be able to apply them when it's the right time to apply them, when it's the right format. So maybe the skills you learn from Kamigawa won't necessarily transfer over to New Capenna, which is the next set, but they might apply to 3 sets down the line or 4 sets down the line. And this is why players that have been playing for a long time can kind of go, oh, I've seen this card before. I've seen this kind of card before. I know what it does. I know it's good. I think players who've been playing for a long time tend to have good card evaluation skills because they go, oh, I've seen, this type of card. I know how it plays. I've played with it before. where that's not necessarily true for newer players. So I guess what I would say to this question is it's really, really helpful to play a wide variety of formats. And I don't just mean different limited formats, I mean constructed formats I think really help too, to kind of expand your Magic vocabulary, your Magic repertoire. It's not always going to pay out immediately in the next set, but you will see it somewhere down the line, and eventually the lessons learned from one set will be able to be applied to another set, and you'll be better for it. Question 8. When should you play an Ugly Splash? So an Ugly Splash being, a double-costed, a double-pipped card, Behold the Unspeakable. How do you determine the need to pursue this strategy within colors, or by adding a splash to make a deck competitive? For example, splashing Behold the Unspeakable in a controlling green-black or green-white deck because you need to have some stronger late-game and controlling options. So my answer to this is don't 99% of the time. I believe a sketchy splash, especially of a double-colored, double-pipped card, or, raw dogging blue card off of 3 basic islands, is going to be more detrimental to your win rate than not. I think people underestimate how bad it is to destroy your mana base like that. It's really, really bad. I was just talking about how bad normal mana bases are, the 9/8. When you throw in a bunch of colorless lands, it's colorless, those islands are colorless for your red and green cards or whatever it is, you're going to decrease the amount of spells you can cast in a timely fashion substantially. So that's my baseline. Now, if you truly feel like your deck is an absolute pile, then you can have an Ugly Splash. Maybe play that Terrarium, play that Network Terminal, get that double-pipped card in there if you've truly train wrecked. But that's an absolute last resort. I think that you are better off playing a pile of medium spells with good mana rather than a pile of slightly better cards with bad mana. And that's the calculus I'm making a lot of the time. Question 9. How do you avoid train wrecks in waffling? I feel like I train wreck a lot without knowing it. I'll make picks and stay open only to feel like everything has been cut. Is there any heuristics to avoid that? And a similar question. The recent Art of Forcing pod, along with my personal tendencies to stay too open, have led me to this question. What advice do you have for a player who tends to waffle and commit too late in the draft? So, good question. I think people that waffle or find themselves waffling too often, or they find themselves unable to commit or unsure when to commit, or kind of just staying too open, I think a lot of times this stems from a sense that the goal of drafting is to find the most open lane. But I think that is not necessarily true. It can be viewed as that, where, in a draft, you're like trying to find the most open colors, but that's not the ultimate end goal. The ultimate end goal is to end up with the best deck at the table, or the best deck that you possibly can in your seat. And that isn't always an overlap with the most open lane, right? A good example is red-green might be the most open color, or the color pair. You might wheel all the hot springs, but just because you have 3 hot springs in your deck doesn't mean that your deck is good. Often what this accounts for is, or what this means is, you're going to be weighing color preferences. You're going to be weighing the cards you've taken early, right? Say you took 3 awesome blue cards, pick 1, 2, 3, and then blue was kind of cut. Well, maybe sometimes you have to move off of it, but maybe sometimes you can figure out a way to play those cards, right? And maybe, red is a little bit more open than blue, but, it's kind of close because, red's not such a strong color, and you're worried about getting into a color that's not that deep. I think the best advice I can give you, and I've given this advice before in the show, but it's in some other places, draft the deck you're drafting until you can't. And what that means is draft your early cards as if you are assuming you're going to play them. You're going, okay, I've taken those awesome 3 blue cards, and I'm gonna try my best to play them. Until you absolutely are getting cut out of it, and you just don't see any blue cards at all, keep assuming you're gonna play them. Because even if you're not seeing them right now, you might see them a little bit later, you might see them in pack 2, that kind of stuff. I think what happens too often is people go, blue card, blue card, blue card, ooh, that's a good black card. And then 4th pick, ooh, that's a good white card. Oh, that's a good red card pack 6, right? And then they get kind of distracted by these wayward signals that might not be signals at all. They're just kind of straight cards. Again, everything comes back to just building out that solid core of one color. if you can just build out that solid core of one color, you're almost never going to train wreck. Because number one, that solid core of one color probably has some good cards because you first picked those cards, right? And they're probably pretty good. And two, even if your core is not the most open color, you can build out that core and then later pair it with the most open. I would just say keep drafting cards that go with your early picks more often than you do if you find yourself train wrecking. And again, the goal of drafting is to end up with the best deck you possibly can, not to find the most open lane. Although there is some overlap there. Question 10, why play monocolored? What are the advantages of playing monocolored instead of just playing all your best cards? Why do people try to aim for monocolored decks when drafting aggro? Great question. Okay, so often on stream, people will ask me when I'm drafting mono red, hey, don't you want to play that Twisted Embrace? Don't you want to play that Kami of Terrible Secrets? You know, those are pretty good cards, right? You would like to play, you know, you've been trained to be like, hey, that's a good card. I want that card in my deck. When you're drafting a monocolored aggro deck, it often behooves you to only play one color for quite a few reasons. Number one, it allows you to play fewer lands. Just like I was talking about before, where you have to maintain your 8/8 sources if you want to have an even split of cards, or an even split of colors, cards in each color. That's really hard to do if you want to go to 15 lands. I mean, it's impossible. You can't have 8 sources unless you have a dual land in your pile, right? And so if I want to, you know, my deck ideally wants, 15 mana sources. It doesn't want to go to 17 mana sources. Sticking monocolored means that you don't have to go to 17 mana sources. You can just play 15. And that's a pretty big benefit. Not having to, replacing 2 lands with 2 spells. That's pretty big. So that's the number one thing. Number 2, consistency. Not having to fuss with your mana. Again, I was just talking about how mana bases are bad. You don't have to worry about, do I draw the right mana early? Do I hit that double black on time? You can just play just monocolored, and then you don't have to worry about that, and you'll curve out more frequently. Aggro decks thrive on consistency. They really, really want to do the same thing every single game, which is play a 1, play a 2, play a 3, attack you, right? If you're stumbling on your mana, that's a nightmare for you in your aggro decks, because then your opponent will be able to stabilize, and you don't have an early board. This even comes across in more kind of subtle ways, where if you have, a lot of times I'll want to like triple spell in my red decks early, or double spell and use a rabbit battery equip activation. And if I have a swamp in my deck instead of another red source, that's a really big problem. Or experimental synthesizer, that's another one where it's like, well, I've got black, red, and if I cast this synthesizer on turn 3 and I hit a red card, I can't cast it, right? So in a lot of ways, it comes back to consistency. The other thing too is if you're split down the middle of like white 1-drops and blue 1-drops, or whatever color 1-drops you have, white and red, that leads to a situation in your games a lot of the time where you have awkward mana sequencing, where you go, okay, well, I want to play this red 1-drop on 1, but I also want to play a blue card. I want to activate my Moon Circuit Hacker, right, and also play my other blue card, or Ninjutsu and my Moon Circuit Hacker, and also play my Network Disruptor. And you just can't do that if you play Mountain on turn 1, right? So, again, this is another way that ties into consistency, but in the actual gameplay, like, forget about which lands you draw. This is just your sequencing of your spells. That matters a lot, too. So, while there is a really good argument for the other side of the coin here, and I think often when I'm streaming, I don't know how much people are memeing or how much people actually like want me to do this, but they'll be like, oh, you've got such like, play mono black, that's you can really get away with a mono black deck here. But if I played mono black, I'd have to be playing some really bad cards to do that, and that's not ideal. If I just played my other green cards, that would be better. And because my mono black deck maybe isn't the most aggressive deck in the world, it doesn't want to skimp on lands, right? It actually wants to hit 5 lands. So the benefit of playing monocolored is actually just not there, because I want to have 17, 18 mana sources in the deck. So a lot of times I see people, kind of flirting with the idea of, oh, should I be monocolored here? And most of the time, if you're not an aggro deck, no, it's better just to play more powerful cards, because the consistency and the playing fewer lands isn't outweighed by you being able to play better spells, which in a longer game, you'll be able to cast those better spells, even though your mana might be a little bit awkward earlier. You don't care about your early mana situation as much. You more care about your later game mana situation, your turn 4 or 5 mana situation. Question 11, how to mulligan less? So what are some of the keys for building a better deck to reduce the likelihood that you need to mulligan versus the potential negative impacts of those plays or overall deck strength? So I have 3 things here. 1, lower your curve. Often when you have an expensive mana curve, you got a lot of 4s, a lot of 5s, you just have to mulligan because you got like 2 lands and a 4 and a 5 and another 4. And, you know, maybe an Imperial Oath in there, right? That's a recipe for having to mulligan a lot. Number 2, have a good mana base. Having a good mana base means you're not going to be stuck with all the black cards and a handful of red cards and green cards, right? The theme of this episode seems to be have a good mana base, actually. It's kind of funny. It's coming back a lot of the time. But if you just have a good mana base, you can put some faith in your deck. Even if you don't have the perfect mana situation in your opening hand, you can go, you know what? I built my deck well. I'm not going to, you know, draw a mountain after I have black and green cards in my hand, and I need to cast those and find my swamp and forest. So one of the benefits or one of the rewards for building a good deck with a good curve with a good mana base is you kind of get to put some faith in your deck and say like, you know what? I know I've built this deck soundly. I can keep this like not perfect hand, but good hand, and I'm going to get rewarded. I was talking about a bit before about not needing to keep perfect hands. Well, you need to keep perfect hands or mulligan to more perfect hands when your deck, you know, the top X cards of your deck, 4, 5, 6, 7 cards of your deck aren't consistently going to provide you with what you need. But if you just need a 2-drop, you just need that one more land of, you know, the black land you need, not the red, black, or blue land, whatever it is, you can more comfortably keep kind of medium hands, right? Point number 3, just mulligan less, honestly. I know I hammer this home a lot, but every day in, you know, when I watch gameplay reviews, when I watch, I do coaching, one of my biggest tips is just, nah, you can keep that hand. Nah, you can keep that hand. It's okay. Even when I stream, you know, people are surprised at the hands I keep. It takes some practice to really get a feel for the range of keepable hands. But again, if you're building those good decks, the range of keepable hands becomes larger, and you'll just have to mulligan less. Question 11. What the heck are even vehicles? When I started playing, vehicles were not a thing. And then I restarted, and all of a sudden, they exist. And they're confusing as hell. Do you have some back-of-the-envelope guidelines for playing the vehicles? Say how many is too many. How many creatures if you have 3 vehicles? So, yeah, vehicles are kind of strange from a design perspective. When they first came out, they had a bit of a misstep in the sense that they released a few vehicles that were just a bit too good. If you played Kaladesh, you know what I'm talking about. This is like Smuggler's Copter, Heart of Kiran. So let me just read actually Smuggler's Copter for those who haven't seen this card before. You know how vehicles are today. This is probably the most busted vehicle, I think. So this is 2 mana for a 3/3 flyer, Crew 1. That's really good on its own. 2 mana, 3/3 flyer, Crew 1. That's great, right? But it also has the ability, when this attacks or blocks, you can draw a card if you do discard a card. So it gets a loot when it attacks or blocks. It got banned in Standard. This was just an absurd card, right? Like, just if hearing it is not enough to grok just how absurd this card is, play it in Cube if you get the chance. It's really, really good. It's really awesome. There was also, at Common, there was the Pain Train, for those who have heard stories of Kaladesh. So this is like a 3 mana, it was a 3 mana Crew 2 vehicle that was a 4/3, but when it attacked, it got +1/+1 in trample. So it was a 3 mana attacking 5/4. It was so hard to block and dealt so much damage, right? So because of that, they kind of have gotten into this space where it's like, all right, we got to tone these vehicles down, and they've been very, very careful, I think, about vehicles. The next time we saw vehicles, they were much worse. They were like 3 mana 4/3s with Crew 1 and stuff like that. They've kind of tinkered a bit with vehicles, the formula of vehicles over the past few years. I think they've got them to a pretty good place, but what that comes down to is often, and you see this in Kamigawa, really there's this distinction between the ones that they didn't quite push enough and the ones that it's like, okay, this was pretty good, right? The rare ones in Kamigawa are pretty good. The Bank Buster, the Surge Hacker Mech, those ones, where the commons are generally not too good. So, I mean, as far as which vehicles should you play, often it just comes down to playing them and figuring out, oh, this one's good, this one's not, just like most of the, cards in any set. But there's somewhat of a vanilla vehicle test, or vehicle vanilla test you can do. Crew 1 tends to be trivial, like very easy to crew. It's almost like nothing. It's not quite Crew 0, but you'll be able to crew this. Crew 2 is manageable. You have to consider it. You have to go, okay, this is a real cost. It means I'm investing a real creature. But I'm probably going to be able to crew this thing. So weigh that versus the upside of the card. Crew 3 is when you start to get to, this is rough territory. I actually really, really need something out of my card here to do something. Crew 3 means you're tapping a real creature, an expensive creature, probably a 4, 5, 6 cost creature. And, for example, we've got like the 2-mana 3/4 flyer vehicle that turns on another vehicle in Kamigawa. That one has Crew 3. That one sees no play. That's partially because the vehicle deck's not very good, but that card alone is not very good. As far as deck composition, it is a card type that needs other creatures to work. So you don't want to be going below, like, I'd say 14 creatures if you have 2 vehicles in your deck. Just like any card that needs creatures to function, a combat trick, equipment, an aura, you generally don't want to be going down to past 15 creatures, I would say. It's a reasonable guideline if you have a lot of these cards in your deck. Question 12, how to win the unwinnable. How do you win those games that you feel far behind, or a game where you're clearly losing? What do you do in those situations, and how do you come back from a losing game or a nearly unwinnable game? So I think the most important thing here, and this comes from experience, because I remember I would instantly just get completely deflated when I was, first playing Magic, first playing Limited, and I ended up in games where my opponent had a good start, or they played a card that was really hard for me to beat. I'd just be like, well, this game's kind of over, right? Like, I'm just like, man, things aren't going my way, and you kind of zone out a little bit. You kind of detach from the game. You're like, you know what, that's all right, like, whatever. I think that the most important thing, and this is, slightly fluffy, but I actually, at least in my experience, this is the most important thing. Just don't lose hope. Like, the most important part of winning games you're behind in is mental game. I really do think so. If you just view the game as a series of exchanges where the more positive exchanges you have, the more likely you are to win. The more negative exchanges you have, the more likely you are to lose. You can kind of plot that on a spectrum. And a good thing happens to you, you're more likely to win. A bad thing happens to you, you're more likely to lose. But I think what happens is the bad thing happens and they shoot that, whatever measurement you're using for on the spectrum way down to 0 and go, well, now the game's just over. I can't win this, right? When a bad thing happens, that's not the end of the world. It's really not. And I actually see this on stream a lot when people, something bad will happen in my game, or they'll play a really good card, and chat will be like, well, that's the game, GG, it's over. And again, I don't know how much of this is like facetious, but I do think a lot of the mentality is, well, can't win now, right? But there are a lot of games that I think one of the ways I put it is you're never too far behind or far ahead than you think you are, right? You're always a little bit closer to center than you might think, right? So that's my number one tip. But of course, there are more kind of solid or more substantial tips I can give you. Check your decks for outs, right? See what, when something bad happens to you, my opponent resolves a Junji, like a bomb rare, an Atsushi, some giant dragon, and you're like, wow, I am not in a position to race that right now. Look in your deck, and you're like, how many outs do I have? Well, you know what? I've actually got 2 removals so that I can deal with it. So, if I do draw those, I'm in a good spot. Or, consider a new game plan. You can go, well, my game plan was to kill all their things, or I was playing this controlling game, and then they play this card where I either can't kill it, or if I kill it, it's very bad for me, like the dragon, right? Or they play a Behold the Unthinkable, or the Unspeakable, where they draw a bunch of cards. It's like, well, maybe it's game over for my plan 1, where my plan was to out-control them, but maybe plan 2 is pretty doable. Maybe I can out-aggro them, right? Or the inverse is true. Your plan was to beat down, right? You're like, okay, attack, and then they wrath you, and you're like, well, that's kind of it. Instead of going, well, my game's over, I go, okay, well, how can I rebuild in that game where I get wrath, right? How many tools in my deck do I have to rebuild? Maybe I have some experimental synthesizers. Maybe I do have a Season of Renewal in my deck. So 2 things, right? 2 big things. Check your deck for outs. Maybe your current game plan still works if you draw those outs. The other thing is try a new game plan, or see if you can formulate a new game plan that doesn't exactly line up with the game plan that you were trying to carry out that got completely wrecked. The number one thing, I already said the number one thing, but one of the big things is you always want to consider the world in which you win the game, right? What is the world in this game that I win? And that might mean drawing a very specific card. That might mean drawing a very specific sequence of cards. But if that world exists, it's not over, right? It's really not over. And again, it goes back to the mental game. Don't think it's just over. Question 13. Am I really incredibly unlucky? When something goes poorly, how can I tell if I just got unlucky or if I put myself in a position where I'm likely to get unlucky? That's a very good question. This question comes up a lot in the kind of in the space of, am I getting unlucky here? Am I making the right plays? How do I know when I made the right plays and it's just, it didn't work out? Or how do I know when I'm actually making bad plays? This is probably a topic that I could go really, really deep on your self-analysis. But just quickly, for the sake of brevity, I will say that if you are less experienced or you are, not, you're newer to the game, or maybe you've been playing, 1-2 years, which, in the grand scheme of things is, pretty long, but I would still say is relatively inexperienced, you're probably less unlucky than you think. I think you're probably less unlucky than you might think. I think in most games, there are, I don't know, let's just put a number to it, 50 individual things to consider. 50 individual points that are important, whether that be number of cards in your opponent's hand, number of lines you can take in a given turn, number of turns it will take to kill your opponent if you're attacking at the same rate over the next few turns, right? Just like all these different factors. If you are a little bit inexperienced or you're kind of intermediate, you're probably going to miss some number of them. You're probably just not going to take in some number of them. So if there's 50 of them, you're going to take in 20 or 30 of them. You're going to miss 20 of them, right? Or 30 of them, whatever it is. And that's going to mean there's going to be something you're missing, right? There's going to be something that feels like you're getting unlucky, but you're missing something. The more experience you gain, the more you'll be able to catch yourself, the more you'll be able to catch those things and kind of self-evaluate, self-assess. But I would just err on the side of I'm probably doing something wrong rather than I'm doing everything right and I'm just getting unlucky, right? There's the idea of making your own luck, which is just the concept of like, you know what? I can put myself in a good position, help myself to get lucky. That takes some skill, that takes some know-how to be able to put yourself in that position in the first place. But yeah, I think, again, this ties into mental game too, where I just think that if you are trying to, if you're trying to blame luck for a substantial number of things or at least a portion of things, I just don't think that gets you anywhere, right? I just don't think that it helps. Now, it helps to identify sometimes, right? I don't want to downplay the fact that, yes, you should still identify, hey, I couldn't win this game any way possible, right? But as far as a improvement mindset goes and getting better at the game, I really don't think it helps to be like, oh, I got unlucky here. I think it helps to just say to yourself, hey, I probably did something wrong. Question 14, ordering triggers. Ordering triggers on the stack in Arena. I'm never confident with the first to last resolution pop-up. If a card is first, does that mean it pops up last on the stack or in the order that it resolves? I mess this up too often. Very simple. This is going to be quick. First in, last out. What that means is the first trigger you put on the stack is the last one that will resolve. Think of it like you're stacking something. That's why it's called the stack. Or you're building floors of a building, right? It'll go from the top down. So whatever one you click on first, it'll put at the bottom, and then the next one goes next and next and next and next. Builds it up. Then it'll resolve in backwards order from top to bottom. Whichever one you want to happen first, that's the last one you're going to want to click. That's it. Easy question. Next up, what exactly is mid-range? What are the defining characteristics of a mid-range deck? So, this is another one. I actually have wanted Jason ILTG on the podcast for a while to get his take on this because he's kind of a mid-range expert. And I think I won't go too in-depth with this, but there is this idea, right? This kind of saying, don't be mid-range. And mid-range decks are bad. You don't want to be somewhere in the middle. You want to be aggressive or you want to be controlling. And I think there's merit to that, but I also think that that really puts mid-range decks in this weird place where people think they're not good. And mid-range decks certainly can be good. Look at mid-range in this format, in Kamigawa. The green mid-range decks, certainly good. And what is the defining characteristic of those decks? Well, I think it's mostly that they are capable of playing both roles well. Capable of pressuring early and capable of grinding a little bit. Now, maybe they don't do either of them particularly well, but they can switch those roles. I think the thing that people often caution you of is you're starting off drafting an aggressive deck, it didn't quite get there, and you have some like weird late game cards. That's like a mid-range space you don't want to be in. Or the opposite. You start drafting like a controlling deck, and you pick up like weird aggro cards. That's not a place you want to be. The most important thing is just that your cards play well together. And as long as you're not shoving control cards with aggro cards and vice versa, I think your deck is going to be probably a fine deck. Most decks don't exist on the extreme control or extreme aggro end of the spectrum. Most decks are mid-range, and the goal is to have cards that help you pressure early and pressure late, or pressure early and grind late. And I think actually a really good subset of cards that helps you do that in Kamigawa are the sagas, right? They're like these cheap creatures, quote unquote, that you can play early and they flip, and you kind of get this undercosted creature, but also they help you get a little bit of value in the late game. When you have cards like that in a format that kind of do both roles, those play well in mid-range. Don't be afraid of mid-range. Just consider not meshing aggro cards and control cards. Question 16. What does the 2/2 do? The opponent swings a 2/2 into a 3/3 while you're tapped out. Do you always block? Do you never block? What do you do? So it's somewhere in between that, right? The question here, of course, is I have a 3/3. My opponent attacks with their 2/2. Clearly, this means something, right? Clearly, they're not just attacking their 2/2 into your 3/3. They've got a trick. They've got something. This is another one I think I could go really, really deep on, but I won't today. I will just say it depends on what your plan is, right? It depends. Yeah, this is the most it depends question I could possibly think of. You could go like honestly an hour dissecting what an attack means given the game state and given what you want to do. But if you are planning to attack your opponent with that 2/2, or the 3/3, you probably don't want to block, right? You're probably saying, you know what? They can get in a few chip damage points here. I can race them back pretty well. I don't want to let them use the trick, right? But if you're controlling, you're just going to block almost every time. Now, the idea behind that is you block, you make them use their trick. They might not be able to use play another creature that turn, and you've kind of they've gotten rid of your creature, but they don't develop their board. Sometimes that gets punished a little bit because they either have a very cheap trick, a 1-mana trick, and they play a 2-drop as well, or they have a card like Suit Up where you kind of got 2 for 1, where it's like, okay, well, if my opponent's casting a combat trick here, I'm just 1 for 1-ing. It doesn't matter that much. But Suit Up is a 2 for 1, so it's like, okay, they kind of did get me in that space. So maybe if you think they specifically have Suit Up, you want to wait a little bit. That's really, really tricky, and it gets into really nebulous spaces where you're like, well, am I controlling? Am I defensive? I'm not sure. The easiest ways I can put this is if you're attacking your opponent and racing them, and you think you are the one that will be able to race better, you should attack, or you should not block, sorry, and then attack the next turn. But if you think, hey, my opponent's probably going to be more aggressive than me, 9 times out of 10, it's right to block and make them use it. Question 17, creature to spell ratios. When it comes to building a limited deck, I'm often suggested in my LGS to stick close as possible to 16 creatures, 7 non-creatures, 17 lands. Could you explain the heuristic / logic behind this card ratio? So I think this is very much a heuristic, and one that players, I think, carry a little bit too late or too far into their game. They hold on to this a little too long. There's no limit, or there's no limit to the number of creatures you can have. There's no minimum number of creatures you want to have. Now, there are certainly decks that, aggro decks want 17 creatures, 18 creatures. Controlling decks maybe want fewer creatures than that. They could, there's formats where like 0 creature decks exist, right? Like Ravnica Allegiance with Dovin's Acuity. That was a good example where you would often have 0 creatures in your deck. There is no actual hard and fast rule. It's much more a guideline. And this one in particular, I think, is one that gets told to newer players because it's just very easy. It's just like pretty good mix of spells, right? Just like, yeah, you're not gonna fall behind on board. You're gonna have a creature to play on turn 2. You're gonna have a creature to play on turn 3. It's all good, and then you have some removal spells in there. That's a decent mix. But really, what it comes down to is ask yourself what your deck wants. Is your deck a deck full of removal spells? Then you don't need to have 15, 16 creatures, right? You can have 10. You can have 11. What really matters is if you have you still want stuff to do on the curve, no matter at all points of the curve. You want to be able to go like cast a 2/2, whether it be an actual 2-drop or a removal spell. Cast a 3/3, whether that be a creature or a card draw spell. You still want to be doing stuff at all points of the game, but that stuff doesn't necessarily have to be creatures. It could be creatures if that's what your deck wants. The exception here's an exception I will say, is if your deck has a lot of cards, like I mentioned before, vehicles, auras, combat tricks that do require creatures, you need to have enough of that card type to enable them. You don't want to have 7 vehicles in your 7 creature deck. That just doesn't work. If you've got a bunch of combat tricks, you don't want to draw all your combat tricks in your opening hand and no creatures. You really want to make sure you have 17 creatures in your deck, I'd say at a minimum. If you've got, I don't know, 5 things they care about creatures. So that's the one exception here. Question 18. Baneslayer or Muldrifter? So this is a kind of a philosophical question. So, Baneslayers, for those who don't know, I'll read the original cards here. So Baneslayer is a 5 mana, 5/5 angel, flying first strike, lifelink, pro demon and dragon. Just like an absurd, ridiculous bomb rare. And Muldrifter is a 5 mana 2/2 flying creature that when it ETBs, you draw 2 cards. The difference between these 2 cards is a Baneslayer comes down, and if it doesn't get answered, it wins the game. Your opponent's just going to die. The Muldrifter, if it gets answered, that's okay, but, because you drew 2 cards, but it's not individually going to be the most powerful card. Your 2 mana 2/2 flyer is not going to end the game. This comes from, I should credit this to Patrick Chapin, who wrote an article a really long time ago about Baneslayers versus Muldrifters. And the idea here is certain types of card. You can slot most threats into either Baneslayers or Muldrifters. They either provide you value when they enter, or they're just like a thing that does a good thing when they're on the battlefield. And in certain formats, in certain contexts, one is better than the other. In a format or against a deck with a lot of removal spells, you certainly wouldn't want the Muldrifter. You don't want the Baneslayer. Baneslayer just comes down, it gets killed. But in a format with not a lot of good removal, or maybe your opponent's deck doesn't have a lot of good removal, you want the Baneslayer because it sticks. Maybe they're like red-based removal. They don't have a lot of 5 damage removal spells. It sticks. It's going to win the game. It's going to do good things. Now, I think this question is asking, in the context of limited, would you prefer a Baneslayer or a Muldrifter? And I think before things were pointed towards Baneslayers a little bit because, like 5, 6, 7 years ago, removal was a bit clunky. It wasn't so good, and you didn't have to worry about your 5 mana flyer getting killed immediately, and you also didn't have to worry about your opponent killing you before turn 5 too often. Now I think formats have sped up a little bit, where I think Muldrifters also back then, they kind of toned them down, where value creatures weren't as good 5, 6, 7 years ago. They kind of were like, well, we don't want to have actual Muldrifters in the format because Muldrifters are very powerful and sort of obnoxious cards sometimes, right? I think it's kind of shifted a little bit, where they've printed better Muldrifters, cards that have good ETB value effects. Think of Sagas, where that kind of counts as a Muldrifter. And I think that because removal has gotten better over the past few years and creatures are pressuring better these days, Baneslayers, these expensive things that if they stick, they're good, but they're kind of liabilities because they can get just bounced or removed, have gotten a little bit worse. Where you see this in practice in Kamigawa is something like Replication Specialist. This is the 5 mana blue flyer, 3/4 flyer that when an artifact enters the battlefield, you can pay 2 and copy it. This card has kind of underperformed, right? Because often what happens is okay, my opponent's pressuring me, and I'm hoping this thing gets me a bunch of value if I untap, but I need to block with it. So I just played a 5 mana 3/4 that I had to block, or they snap off a removal spell because the removal spells are pretty good in this format. There's always a trade-off. There's gonna be some Baneslayers cards that belong to that Baneslayer camp that are so much better than the Muldrifters. It's of course you play this card, right? But there's also gonna be formats where it's yeah, you really don't want cards that don't generate value when they enter because there's so many good removal spells. Midnight Hunt, Innistrad Midnight Hunt was a good example of this. There was a bunch of pretty decent 4, 5, 6 mana cards that didn't generate value when they entered. Maybe they were massive creatures, 7/6 Menacer, but there was a bunch of good removal, so you didn't really want them in your deck. I think the opposite is true for Crimson Vow potentially, where it's the Baneslayers of that format were just the ridiculous bomb rares that they came down and, man, you needed, they were so good that they really put your opponent to the test and asked, do you have a removal spell right now? Because if you don't, you're going to die, right? There's also a spectrum of how quickly the Baneslayer will take over the game. Sometimes it's well, it takes 5 turns. Sometimes it's Dreadfeast Demon. It's no, it takes over in 1 turn, right? So, in general, yeah, I tend to value Muldrifters over Baneslayers, but there's always exceptions. Question 19. Should you be a metagamer? All things being equal, would a proficient limited player be better spending time following the draft meta or focusing on learning better gameplay fundamentals? I will point you to one Andrew Beckstrom, BK, to answer this question. So BK, who is the 3rd member of Team Resources when we do the team showdowns, is a phenomenal player, just an absolutely amazing player. His fundamentals are, bar none. He comes into these drafts not drafting the format at all, right? He just goes, yeah, I'll just figure it out as I go, use my fundamentals. Maybe he'll do 1 or 2 drafts, of course, but he consistently draft these awesome decks because he has such a core, strong, fundamental sense, right? Obviously, we can't all be BKs, but I do think that he's kind of a testament to this idea that if you just have strong fundamentals, if you're just got some really, you've built up your repertoire of good Magic skills, you can get thrown into any format and you can probably draft a pretty good deck. And yeah, maybe if you learn the format, you won't be passing AOs over anvils. But I do think that, like, if you just have that fundamental knowledge, you'll go a really, really long way. Right? I think that'll bring you a really long way. Now, going back to the kind of metagame thought, where I think recently or in the past few years, where metagame has become more of an important thing because there's just more of a metagame, because people play more often. You can kind of see the trends in the meta. You can even see on 17 lands the meta, how it works. I think that there is a kind of a shift where it's like, well, I should be drafting the red decks on this week and the black decks on this week. I do think that's true, and I even advocate for that, right? I think that there is a lot to be said for example, right now, I'm not drafting green very much in Kamigawa because I think that's a very, green is very contested. So I'm like, you know what? That's a metagame call. I just don't want to fight that fight of fighting over green. Do I think you should pay more attention to that than your fundamentals? No. Your time would be much better spent listening to a podcast like this than looking over the metagame data, I think, on 17 lands. Do I think it has value? 100%. And do I think it's a good edge to have after you got those fundamentals? Yeah, I think for sure. But I think that if you're going to choose one or the other, definitely focus on improving your skills over your metagame call. Question 20, last one. Should I attack? Yes. That's my answer. You should attack. And that's it. Pretty long show today, but I hope we got in a lot of your questions. If your question was not read, I apologize. There were a lot of questions. Hope this was cool. I hope this was a cool format. I know it was very bouncing all over the place. It wasn't the most cohesive episode, but touched on a lot of stuff. So I hope somebody, or everybody, ideally, got something out of this. And I hope that those people, like I was saying in the beginning, that knew a lot of this stuff, knew the answers, kind of revisited and touched on some of these concepts, refreshed their memory. I'm going to open up to the chat for a Q&A, for more Q&A. I don't think there's going to be too much, I imagine, but if there's something that I didn't answer and you really want the answer to, or a clarification on something, or just a question that you had that came to mind, I guess this is not exactly anonymous because I'll know your Twitch name. But if you have a question, well, I'm happy to answer for closing us out here. Okay, question 1 of the second part of this Q&A. How long did it take you to have a strong sense of when you're losing to mistakes versus variance? Man. A long time, I will say. I think that is really hard. Okay, so I've been playing Limited Magic now for 10 years, 9 years maybe. I think when I played a lot in that time. Like, there was never a point where I didn't play a lot, like a draft a day at least. And in that time, I would say I started getting good, like what I would consider like reasonably good around the, like maybe around Diamond level in Arena, to put some, have an analog, like 5 years in. And I guess that's actually maybe even slow. Maybe I was slow on the uptake there. But even at that point, I don't think I was noticing when I was making mistakes. Up until maybe like 2 years ago, I would even say I was pretty not great at that. I think even now, I look back on times that I thought I was good, and I'm like, oh, man, I was not good then. and I'm thinking that as well. But I'm sure in 5 months, I'm going to think the same thing. So it's really like, it's progression. You're going to notice things as you get better. You're going to notice more things. Again, it's like I was talking about. If there's 50 things to notice in a game, maybe I'm noticing 40 of them, let's say. That sense of, are you making a mistake or is it variance? Especially from streaming, you have, 400 people pointing out your mistakes and being like, oh, you could have done this better. You could have done that. I'm like, yeah, you know what? That's right. So even today in all my games, I'm making mistakes that sometimes you can be like, yeah, I got a little bit unlucky there. But sometimes it's like, yeah, you could have done something better here. Or even worse, there's like things that not even chat notices and you don't notice. And it like came from something 4 steps back that snowballed, that it's like, there's no way nobody could have seen that. So, you get a sense of it as you go on. You're never going to have an awesome sense of it, but it takes a long time. I know that's not the best, answer, but if it makes you feel any better, it took me a very long time. what do you do for multi-blocks? How do you weigh the risk versus rewards? So another very complex topic, kind of like the 3-3, the 2-2 attacking to the 3-3, that I could go on forever about. Early on, double block less. Later in the game, block more. Because early on, a double block is more of a blowout on tempo. Later on, you can kind of come back from that tempo blowout if the double block is bad, or they have a trick, or whatever it is. Early on, if you double block on turn 4, often that's just a tempo blowout you can't come back from. So it's a very, very rudimentary, very blanket way of answering that, but that's my baseline, I'd say. Is it weird for me to not pay as much attention to 17 lands data after a month of playing the format? I found that some cards were rated weaker, start overperforming for me and vice versa. No, so that's not weird. I think that 17 lands' best use case is as a great baseline. And if you're finding success in cards that 17 lands doesn't like very much, or the opposite, that often points to you developing some sort of drafting style in the format, right? You know what you're winning with, and you get better at that because you're playing it more. And so, yeah, no, I don't think it's bad at all. I will say that 17 lands can have a lot of value still in the format, because as people kind of understand what works in a format, what doesn't, you can start to filter for, look at the last week, look at the last 2 weeks of data, and that becomes more useful than like aggregate data, and that's also pretty good. I guess it could never hurt to look at more data, right? It's only going to help you. It's only more information. I don't look at, hey, you're not following exactly what the data says to be a bad thing at all. No, I wouldn't say so. I often find myself drafting 2 decks. Like, I know I'm base black, but find myself alternating between good red and good blue cards. When do I commit? Great question. I don't have a good answer. It depends on the draft. Sometimes you commit pack 3. Sometimes you commit pack 2. When you put yourself in that position of being deep in one color, you afford yourself the flexibility of saying, I don't have to commit right away. Now, there, of course, comes a certain point where you're like, yeah, I've got to commit. But that point often comes when you pick up a card that's awesome in blue or red or whatever it is that the color you're trying to decide, or you just pick up a density of the cards. Like, often what will happen is you go, okay, there's enough packs in a row where I couldn't take a black card, so I took a red card, and then I took another red card, then I took another red card. You have a density of red cards, you're like, okay, I'll just take that. Or there comes a point where you're like, oh, hey, I got past an inventive iteration. Okay, I'll just be blue here. So there's no hard and fast rule of what's too late or too early to commit. And as you go through the draft, you kind of just have to feel that out based on how many cards you've picked up of the other color and the quality of the cards. All right, everybody, thank you so much for hanging out. I've answered many, many, many questions today. Yeah, thank you once again for everybody hanging out in Twitch chat. If you want to see the visuals for the show, which there are visuals, even though it was mostly a wordy podcast today, you can check those out on the Limited Level Ups YouTube. That is, it's the best place for all my content. All my draft videos, the podcasts go up there. My coaching session videos go up there. Lots of great stuff. Check it out. And yeah, we'll see you next time on the next episode of Limited Level Ups. See you later.